Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Rob Matheson, and this is the News Hour live from Doha, coming up in the next 60 minutes.
President Trump made the right decision to say that's not going to work.
The U.S. Secretary of State says peace talks with the Taliban are dead for now after Donald Trump cancelled a secret meeting in Camp David.
We haven't received anything, so it's still no. We're not going to start over every 3 months.
France threatens to veto any Brexit extension, even as a second cabinet minister lands another blow to Boris Johnson by resigning. The Syrian government says joint patrols by Turkish and U.S. troops in the country's northwest is a blatant violation of its sovereignty.
And I'm Leah Harding with sports as Ferrari win their home Grand Prix for the first time in almost a decade. And Canada celebrates its first tennis Grand Slam champion as Bianca Andreescu stuns Serena Williams in the final of the U.S. Open.
U.S. President Donald Trump says he's cancelled a secret meeting with the Taliban in the United States. Leaders were supposed to fly to Camp David on Saturday night. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says talks with the Taliban are now dead for the time being, and the special envoy is being recalled. Meetings between him and the Taliban had been going on in Qatar for nearly a year.
And it was the case that when the Taliban tried to gain negotiating advantage by conducting terror attacks inside of the country, President Trump made the right decision to say that's not going to work. We're going to walk away from a deal if others try to use violence to achieve better ends in a negotiation. It's not right. It's not appropriate. It killed an American, and it made no sense for the Taliban to be rewarded for that kind of bad behavior.
Well, the Taliban has released a statement in response saying Americans will suffer more than anyone else because of Trump's decision to cancel the talks, while the office of Afghan President Ashraf Ghani says peace will only be possible if the Taliban stop launching attacks and hold direct talks with the government.
We expected an outcome that could lead us to a ceasefire, that could lead us to a direct negotiation with the Afghan government and the Taliban. So unfortunately, that's we didn't see. On contrary, we saw and we observed that there could be risks to any process that the Afghan government is not the main stakeholder in that. And any process that cannot guarantee a ceasefire, a halt to the violence, could be harmful for all of the achievements that we've gained.
Well, Tony Burley is standing by in Kabul. But first, let's go to Rob Reynolds in Washington, D.C. Rob, how is the news of this cancellation playing out there?
Well, certainly there was a lot of shock, Rob, when President Trump tweeted on Saturday that there had been this meeting planned for Camp David. Camp David, of course, is a very historically significant place. And many wondered whether the idea of having the Taliban leadership go to meet with the president there was appropriate. But now that the meeting is off, people are saying that the president made the right call, at least those within his own inner circle. As you just heard from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he said that the talks are dead for the time being. He gave no indication as to whether or when they might restart. Secretary Pompeo also warned that things are about to get worse, in his words, for the Taliban after the killing of a U.S. soldier in a car bomb attack in Kabul on Thursday. Now, members of the president's own party, as well as members of his inner circle, including the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, had been dubious about the talks with the Taliban. They had been counseling the president that the Taliban's word could not be taken at face value and that the organization could not be trusted to keep its promises. But the president has made promises of his own, namely that he would withdraw the remaining 14,000 U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Not to do so or to not be able to fulfill that pledge could have political repercussions for Trump. And Trump has used this tactic before, Rob, both as a businessman and as president, of walking away from a deal in the final stages if he felt that he could get a better position or a strengthened negotiating position by doing so. You will recall that in the run-up to his first meeting with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, he abruptly canceled the talks, and then the talks were back on after a fairly short time. So it would not be surprising, I think, for many in Washington to find out that after a certain period of time, the talks were to resume. But that is completely up to President Trump.
Rob, for now, thanks very much indeed. I want to go to Tony Bertley, who's with us from Kabul. Obviously, the Afghan government has essentially been sidelined from many of the talks that Rob's been talking about there. What's the reaction been there?
Well, in public, they're very supportive of the American peace process. In private, they have been very critical. But today, they're welcoming this move by the US president. They've always said that they should be party to these talks. The Taliban refuse to talk directly to the Afghan government. They consider them puppets of the Americans and illegitimate and corrupt. Ironically, the way this has all played out, that the Taliban said that they were close to an agreement whereby they were going to start talking with the Afghan government on September the 23rd. They perhaps have been the most surprised by this tweet from Donald Trump, because they were expecting this draft agreement to be a done deal. They said they were talking on Saturday with Mr. Khalilzad, the chief US negotiator, and according to a statement they've released today, that they said that both sides were in total agreement. The agreement was finalized. International and regional countries had been in agreement with this, and they were very surprised that this has been stopped at this stage. They tweeted positive statements on Saturday, so this has come as a shock to them. But they also said in their statement that America, as you said before, would suffer more than they would. Now, that's anyone's guess what that's going to mean. There's two choices facing the Taliban now. Do they go away, escalate the conflict, or do they come back to the negotiating table at some point in a different frame of mind? We're trying to wait and see which frame of mind that will be.
Tony, thanks very much indeed. Let's talk to David Sedney. He's a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan and Central Asia. He's joining us on Skype from Kabul. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for giving us your time. One watching from the outside will get the sense that we were reaching a significant moment in these talks if this secret meeting was supposed to be held at Camp David. Do you think, given your diplomatic background, sir, that the president's reaction and response has been proportionate?
I would say that certainly from my perspective here in Kabul, talking to Afghans, I think the majority of people that I speak to welcome this decision. The fact that this agreement was reached earlier in the week and then followed by a wave of attacks on Afghan cities in the north and the west of the country, and then by a brutal bombing here in Kabul, sent the message to Afghans that the Taliban were not interested in peace. Their focus was on military victory, and that the U.S. agreement was a withdrawal agreement, not a peace agreement. So from that perspective, I think there is clearly a lot of work to be done. The Taliban are claiming that the U.S. will suffer, but in fact, it's Afghan civilians who are suffering the most. They're the ones who are being killed every day
There were
by the
fears
Taliban
pro-Brexit peers could deliberately
crossfire
hold
between
up
the
the bill
Taliban
so
and
it could
government
not
forces.
get royal assent before
But
Parliament
by
is
and large, I
prorogued.
think most Afghans think this is the
Throughout
right
Hong
thing.
Kong's political
Many would
crisis,
love
the
to have seen
citizen
peace,
battle
but they
Carrier
didn't
has
think the
refused
agreement
calls
that
to
the
step
U.S.
down.
brought
But an
was going
audio
to be a peace
recording has
agreement.
emerged where she
We heard
sat
earlier on US
business
Secretary of State
leaders
Mike
as
Pompeo
she
saying that the
repeated
deal
she
was
could on
essentially
Tuesday.
dead for now. What does it take, do you think, to try to get this process back on the road again?
I think it will take really a mindset change on the part of the Taliban. They have to show that they want peace, that they are willing to stop using violence. If they do that, then the talks can resume. But right now, again, the very direct, not just signals, the actions by the Taliban over the last week have been exactly the opposite, that they're interested in military victory, not in peace. And how that's going to play out inside the Taliban is a difficult question.
Give us some context on that, sir, if you would. How much of a disconnect is between the Taliban members who are going through the negotiation process and are at the leadership, and the Taliban groups on the side in perhaps do not want this peace process to work?
Well, I'm not inside the Taliban, so I can't say that with certainty, but it does appear that there's a fairly large disconnect between the Taliban negotiators and what the Taliban commanders were doing. This coordinated assault across northern and western Afghanistan on 4 provincial capitals was not something that they did on the spur of the moment. It had to have been carefully planned, carefully thought out, a lot of logistics put in place before these attacks took place. And it doesn't appear that the existence of this agreement in Doha made any difference to the military commanders here. So I think it's very much an open question as to whether the Taliban speak with one voice.
Thank you very much indeed for giving us your analysis. David Sedney, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
The British government insists it will stick to Prime Minister Boris Johnson's plan to exit the European Union by October the 31st, despite multiple setbacks in Parliament and the resignation of a senior minister on Saturday. Amber Rudd, who was Work and Pensions Secretary, says she no longer believes the government is actually trying to get a deal. She'd voted to stay in the European Union in the referendum 3 years ago. Meanwhile, France's foreign minister is rejecting another delay of Brexit and says the UK needs to show the way forward.
With how things are now, it's still no to pushing back the Brexit deadline. The UK says they want to push forward alternatives to avoid a no deal, but we haven't received anything, so it's still no. We're not going to start over every 3 months. It's up to the UK to show us the way forward.
Paul Brennan has more from London.
This is a significant resignation and one that will bruise Boris Johnson. You would have thought perhaps he couldn't be more bruised after the torrid week that he's had, losing votes in Parliament and finding himself painted into a corner as far as his Brexit strategy goes, unable to call a snap general election, for example. But Amber Rudd is a senior and respected member of the Conservative Party, and it's significant for 2 reasons. First of all, the timing of it, choosing Saturday evening to make her announcement, and that meant that she was able to do a tour of the Sunday morning political TV shows here in the UK. And second of all, because of the language that she used in her resignation letter and in those subsequent interviews that she's given. I mean, she said that the expulsion of the 21 Conservative MPs who were thrown out of the party by Boris Johnson for voting against him, she described that as an assault on decency and democracy. Very strong words. And she also flatly contradicted the government's stated position as far as negotiations with the European Union. Boris Johnson has said that he is strongly pursuing a deal with the European Union, but Amber Rudd says that's simply not the case. From her insider's view, she said that she saw no negotiations, only conversations. And she said that she no longer believes that leaving with a deal is the government's main objective. 90% of the government's time, she said, was being put into preparing for no deal. She said that that seemed to be the main strategy of the government. And for those 2 reasons, her resignation is deeply significant.
A day of protest that started peacefully in central Hong Kong has ended in more chaos. Demonstrators set barricades on fire, blocked major roads and vandalized a metro station. Earlier, thousands marched peacefully to the US consulate. They're calling on Congress to pass human rights legislation, allowing sanctions to be imposed on Hong Kong leaders. Divya Gopalan has this update from Hong Kong.
This is one of Hong Kong's main shopping districts, usually a very busy place on a Sunday night. And as you can see, it's been brought to a standstill with white police over here blocking the roads. They chased the protesters here from the financial district and tried to disperse them using tear gas among the shoppers and the crowds on a Sunday night. Not long ago, we saw people running with small children without any protection away from the tear gas. So instead now of just protesters here confronting the police, what we are seeing is regular shoppers and regular people trying to confront the police to ask them why they're using such excessive force when there are people who have nothing to do with the protests. Now, this has been a constant refrain, and this has been the next step in the protests that we're seeing, where people want police accountability for their actions. This is in stark contrast to the protests we saw earlier today, when thousands of people marched to the U.S. Embassy calling on the U.S. to push through a bill that would give them greater powers to safeguard Hong Kong's autonomy.
Plenty more ahead on the News Hour, including how conflict is affecting children. We'll be live in New York as the United Nations sends a message to world leaders. The truce in what's called the Wild West of Nigeria. Government leaders say it's time to end the killings and the kidnappings. And Khabib continues to go unbeaten after his latest bout. We'll hear from him in sport with Leah. The Syrian government has condemned joint US-Turkish patrols in northwest Syria as a flagrant violation of its sovereignty. Armed vehicles crossed the Turkish border on Sunday into an area that used to be controlled by US-backed Kurdish forces. The US and Turkey want to establish a safe zone in the area. Turkey's boosting its military presence along its border with Syria, and it's pushing displaced Syrians to return home. Let's bring in Joe Macaron. He's a Middle East analyst at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. We appreciate your time, sir. Thank you very much. There is opposition to this, obviously, from Syria, but there also appears to be, as far as I can see, opposition by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, because he has been disagreeing with the US about the conditions and details of this safe zone. Is it actually, in practical terms, going to happen?
It's going to happen, but it's a temporary fix. It's not a long-term fix of this problem. The U.S. is trying to mediate two rivals, two enemies across the border. Erdogan is hoping that his meeting with Trump in a few weeks at the UN can help solve some of the issues he's pushing, which have a longer safe zone, a deeper, around 30, 40 kilometers. The U.S. is offering only 5 at this point. And also, who controls this area? Turkish sides wanted to be under Turkish troops' control. The U.S. prefer rather to have American troops, French and British, to have more third-party control. So those issues are still pending between both sides. But at the end of the day, this is just to manage a very complex relation. It's not a long-term solution. It's not a way forward to have stability in the country or in the northern part of Syria.
If I understand it correctly, there are still Kurdish YPG forces in this area. Of course, Turkey regards them as terrorists, but they are allies of the US and have been in the fight against ISIL. How great is the risk, do you think, that there is going to be some sort of direct conflict between Turkish forces and the Kurdish YPG whilst the US forces are there?
There's always a risk because there's no mediation between both sides. They're still in a enmity somehow. There's always this risk. But now there's this engagement area. The Kurdish forces decided to pull back a little bit, especially their heavy weapons, their main militant. They backed away from this area in the past few days to pave the way for this deal to start. But at the end of the day, you had the Manbij model, for example, where you still see a lot of confrontation between both sides. So now the stakes are higher because, especially the U.S., they want at some point to be able to withdraw their forces from this area. But now they became more involved in managing those two. But the risks are always there. But I think for now, I don't see any risk of confrontation. But we have to watch the coming weeks what will happen.
President Erdogan has also made the point that he wants this safe zone to be at least used in part as a safe haven, if you like, for refugees from Syria, rather than moving them into Turkey or indeed moving them back from Turkey into this safe zone prior to moving back into their homes in Syria. But again, given the confusion that you've been explaining to us, do you think that that is actually likely going to happen? And is it, in fact, going to be a safe place for refugees?
I mean, it's not clear at this point. I'm not sure. Erdogan is obviously under a domestic pressure to deal with the Syrian refugee issue, especially in Istanbul after the last municipal election. But I'm not sure if this part will be helped, especially if it was only 5 kilometers. If you're going to bring Syrian refugees brought from Turkey. This will change the demographics. This will bring a lot of conflicting interests on the ground. This will put a proxy war somehow between the pro-Kurdish fighters and the pro-Turkish fighters. We don't know yet if it's 5 kilometers or more will enough be the border for them, because the agreement in the U.S. mind was to have a zone which is without civilians, without fighters, just a disengagement part of on the border. So I'm not sure if this will be Erdogan's way out of the Syrian refugee issues. He might have to find other solutions on other parts of the border.
Good to get your views on this. Joe Macaron, thank you very much indeed for your time. The head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog has met Iranian officials a day after Tehran further scaled down its commitments to the 2015 nuclear deal. Tehran announced on Saturday that it could now increase uranium enrichment levels beyond 20%, but it doesn't have plans to do so yet. The Iranian foreign minister has told the IAEA that its actions are allowed under the deal. France has urged Iran not to downgrade its commitments, saying the channels for dialogue are still open. Dossa Jabari has the latest from Tehran.
This was a pre-scheduled meeting between the acting head of the International Atomic Energy Agency and Iranian officials. As part of their ongoing cooperation, officials from the nuclear watchdog come to Tehran on a regular basis. But this visit comes at a time when the future of the 2015 nuclear deal is very uncertain. Iran continues to reduce its commitments, as it announced on Saturday how they will move forward with advancing their nuclear program and that they will no longer adhere to the limitations that have been set under the JCPOA. Ali Akbar Salehi, the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, says Iran will not stay in this deal as long as it's a one-way road.
The EU was supposed to cover the absence of the United States, and they couldn't do it in a way they'd promised. And the worst thing is, we'd heard from the spokesman of the EU saying they'd remain committed to the JCPOA as long as Iran does. I'm surprised. EU is committed to what? Committed to not being committed to the deal or breaking promises?
Cornel Faruta has also been meeting with Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani. This is being viewed as a critical point in the future of the relationship between Iran and the remaining European signatories of the nuclear deal, that's France, Germany, and Britain. The Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has issued yet another 60 days for the Europeans to try and salvage this deal.
Iran says the oil from its tanker that was released by Gibraltar 3.5 weeks ago has been sold. Iranian state television said the $130 million worth of oil has gone to its destination. The United States says this satellite image proves that the destination was Syria. Iran had promised that the Adrian Darya 1 supertanker, formerly the Grace 1, would not go to Syria. Fighting in Libya has killed at least 14 people. Warlord Khalifa Haftar's forces battled with soldiers from the UN-recognized Government of National Accord. 8 of Haftar's forces died, along with 6 soldiers in Sabia, southwest of Tripoli. At least 1,000 Libyans have been killed since Haftar launched an offensive to capture the capital 5 months ago. Thousands of islanders in the Bahamas are abandoning their homes destroyed by Hurricane Dorian. The strongest storm ever recorded there is known to have killed 43 people. That total is likely to climb significantly as recovery crews reach more remote and devastated islands. Manuel Rapallo reports from Freeport, the main city on Grand Bahama Island.
Floodwaters have finally receded on the island of Grand Bahama. For residents of this part of the country, this means coming to terms with the devastation left over from Hurricane Dorian. On the eastern end of the island, more than 80% of homes were destroyed. This high school near Freeport's tourist district has been transformed into a shelter for the displaced. Many here have lost everything to the hurricane, even their loved ones.
For me, I lost my husband, and because he decided to stay back home. And from what I've seen and heard, everything is like completely gone. So, you know, it's really hard because, you know, being up there all your life, you don't know any place else but home.
About 80 people are staying at this shelter. Freeport remains without electricity, and the heat is almost unbearable. But there is food and water, and doctors on site to provide medical attention to anyone who needs it.
But I really thank God for life right now, and I thank God for the U.S. Coast Guards and everybody who participated, you guys, and bringing us food and clothes and water and stuff. Yeah, man.
Search operations continue for hundreds of people still missing, but the destruction from the storm is so widespread that even with the assistance of the United States Coast Guard and Border Patrol, there are still places in the country that rescue teams have yet to reach. One of the biggest challenges in delivering disaster relief to survivors of Hurricane Dorian has been limited access to the areas worst hit by the storm. Only up until a few days ago, this airplane, for example, along with Freeport Airport, were sitting under at least 2 meters of floodwaters. It's been several days since the storm passed. Many of the people we've met seem to still be in shock, but nonetheless grateful to be alive.
Manuel Rapallo is joining us live from the Bahamian capital, Nassau. Extraordinary pictures, as always, in your report there, Manuel. But one of the things that continues to strike me is the scale of the problem, because the Bahamas, of course, is not just just one or two islands. We're talking about a smattering of islands across the sea. It must be very difficult to get aid to all of those areas.
That's absolutely right. That continues to be the challenge here in the Bahamas, not only in the island of Grand Bahama, where we were yesterday, in Freeport, where we filed that report that you just watched, but specifically the island of Abaco, arguably the place that was worst hit. The community of Marsh Harbor, we're talking about upwards of 80% of all homes are completely destroyed. What we're hearing from the World Food Program, the World Health Organization, is that there are 70,000 people in need of food and in need of shelter. We've known since the storm first passed, which again, we should mention the scale of this devastation. It took 36 hours for this hurricane to make it across the island of Abaco and across the island of Grand Bahama. This was a Category 5 storm, wind gusts upwards of 350 kilometers per hour. So when we're talking about destruction, that's almost the equivalent of a tornado touching down every minute for 36 hours. It's unbelievable, the scale of the devastation. Even when we were driving through Marsh Harbor, you could smell the death in the air. There are places of the Bahamas, as you mentioned, a smattering of islands. There are places where rescue teams haven't arrived yet. So while we continue to hear now for the second day in a row this official death toll of 43 people, the actual number is expected to be dramatically higher. Everyone that we spoke to in Freeport yesterday just about told us that they knew at least one person that was still missing. Just about everyone we spoke to had someone in their family that had passed away. So there is a sense that the scale of this devastation has yet to really be determined. At the moment, the biggest concern is the shortages of food, water, and medicine. But now that the infrastructure is being rehabilitated, we're talking about roadways, runways, and access to helicopters is now being rehabilitated. There are rescue teams. There is disaster relief arriving to these communities that are worst hit. But for thousands of people, they have nowhere to go. And here in Nassau, there's staging areas by international organizations and the national government for the displaced. But the sense that we're getting and the reports that we're hearing here on the ground is that there just isn't enough for everybody that's suffering from the wake of this hurricane.
Thanks, Manuel. Still ahead on Al Jazeera, warnings of election interference as the US gears up for the 2020 presidential race. Designing the modern world, we took a look at the impact of the Bauhaus School 100 years on. And a new air race world champion's been crowned. Leah's going to have the details in the sport.
Hello. Once again, rain has been reported in southern Pakistan. The cloud confirms it. It's a little bit late in the season and the monsoon should be withdrawing, but it's taking its time about it. However, we have got a change of season in Europe and beyond Europe to the stands. This weakness in the sky, this line of showers runs from Armenia all the way to Tajikistan through Turkmenistan, and that's where you'll see rain falling. but south of it you will not see it. But you will see that northerly breeze, which is slowly bringing the temperatures down. Not everywhere, but Tehran's down to 28, Baghdad to 40, and with the same hint of a northerly in the eastern Med, Beirut's down to about 29. Not a huge change, admittedly, but the wind is strengthening and that northerly is blowing down the Gulf. It's not particularly dusty at the moment, nor has it dropped humidity very much. It's still on the cusp of being unpleasant in Bahrain and Qatar as examples. But the humidity is really high, and that's where it should be in Salalah, with the Kharif still blowing, probably enhanced again by the time we get to Tuesday, which means cloud and drizzle and greenness around Salalah. A record-breaking high temperature in Cape Town yesterday, about 35 degrees. Back down to at or below normal now in the sunshine, but there is rain further east, just touching southern Mozambique.
Fall in love with thousands of brands with Prime Wardrobe.
You're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. The U.S. Secretary of State says talks with the Taliban are dead for the time being, and the special envoy to Afghanistan is being recalled. Taliban representatives say the cancellation of talks will harm the U.S. more than anyone. The British government is insisting it will exit the European Union by October the 31st, despite multiple setbacks in Parliament and the resignation of a senior cabinet minister. Meanwhile, France says it doesn't want another Brexit delay and says the UK needs to show the way forward. Protesters have blocked a major road in Hong Kong's central district and vandalized a metro station. Earlier, thousands marched peacefully to the U.S. consulate. They're calling on Congress to pass legislation which allows sanctions to be imposed on leaders. Let's go to New York, where thousands of school backpacks are being laid outside the United Nations after the worst year on record for children caught up in armed conflict. The UN says 2018 saw the highest number of children killed or maimed since they began monitoring. The new exhibition shows backpacks laid in rows, similar to a graveyard, each one representing the loss of a young life to conflict. Well, across the 20 conflict zones monitored last year, the UN found more than 12,000 children were killed or injured. Afghanistan had the worst record, with 3,062 children killed. 1,854 deaths were recorded in Syria. 2018 was also the worst year for children being used in combat, particularly in Somalia, Syria, and Nigeria. 7,000 have fought on front lines around the world. These conflicts are putting the education of millions of children at risk. Mali is the most serious example. More than 800 schools were closed last year, leaving 244,000 children with no education. Our diplomatic editor James Bays is live with us from the United Nations in New York. James, it looks from what I can see behind you a very sobering image, but one questions, of course, what the impact is going to be on the members of the United Nations.
Well, absolutely, and that, I think, is what the UN's children's agency, UNICEF, is hoping, that this will have a big impact, because these backpacks, 3,758 of them, represent children who've died, and these are just the confirmed deaths. They believe there were many more deaths in 2018. They hope that people will take notice. World leaders coming here for the UN General Assembly in just a couple of weeks will take notice. With me is Christopher de Bono from UNICEF. Christopher, a very haunting image.
It is a haunting image, and we want people to be haunted by it, but also inspired by it. In the 30 years since the Convention on the Rights of the Child came into effect, there have been massive improvements for children, and around severe acute malnutrition, around polio, and that's because people have stood up and taken action. What we want these backpacks to do is to inspire people to take action, because even though the figure, the 3,758, is the highest figure of children killed in conflict since we started taking collecting data, we think it can change. And if world leaders, if people all around the world seeing these backpacks are inspired to think about the situation of children and to take the responsibility that they have to put children at the center of every action they do, it will change. And next year, these backpacks will be being carried by children to school, which is what they're intended for. That's what their purpose is.
Isn't the problem, though, you mentioned the convention 30 years ago, you could go much further back, the Geneva Conventions. There are rules of war, and countries and parties to conflict seem to be ignoring them.
That's certainly the case in some situations. Obviously, the attacks on education institutions, the attacks on health facilities, they're still occurring in appalling numbers. But they've got to stop. They have to. There's no doubt. This is our future laid out here. Each one of these backpacks should, in the next 2 weeks, be en route to a school somewhere. It represents lost hope. It represents lost lives. And we can't afford that. Humanity can't afford that. We have to do something.
The timing of this, I assume, is quite deliberate, because in 2 weeks' time, here in this complex, there'll be leaders from all around the world.
Yes, world leaders will be gathered here, and we know that they can take action that can help change the situation of children.
Christopher de Bono from UNICEF, thank you very much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Really haunting image, all of these backpacks. Of course, killing civilians is a war crime, so many of these are not just deaths of children, they are criminal actions taken in conflict zones around the world, Rob.
James, thanks very much indeed. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has voted in a contentious regional election in Moscow. Opposition and independent candidates are banned from the ballot in the capital. That's provoked months of some of the largest protests seen for years. Hundreds of protesters were arrested, many have been beaten up by riot police, and some have been jailed. Step Vassen has more on this from Moscow.
It's interesting to see that these elections, which normally are considered unimportant, have attracted so much attention, and that comes all, of course, because it has led to a lot of protests that haven't been in Russia for quite a lot of years. It has created a new kind of protest movement with also a lot of young people, students joining in, and also the crackdown by the government of these protests has put this election on the international agenda. I can say a lot of media from all over the world have come to actually cover it. We just followed the opposition leader, who's not allowed to run herself, and she was followed by dozens of cameras showing that this vote for only 45 members of the Moscow Duma has significance for the rest of the country as well. They have also now called, instead of boycotting these elections because the opposition candidates are not allowed to run, they have now called to still come to the polling stations and vote for anyone except for United Russia, the ruling party of President Vladimir Putin, in a way to show that the opposition is strong, stronger than the government has always said. The result will be that it will be more difficult for President Putin to continue after his last term, which is now happening right now. So the question now, of course, is will this be successful, this strategy, because there are opposing voices. The opposition is divided on this particular strategy, which is called smart voting. And we will see later what the outcome is going to be.
One of the strongest typhoons to hit the Korean peninsula in decades has killed people on both sides of the border. Typhoon Ling Ling killed 5 people in North Korea and destroyed homes and crops. The North's leader Kim Jong-un reportedly scolded officials for being helpless and unaware of Saturday's storm. South of the border, 3 people were killed and many have been left without electricity. In northwest Nigeria, the government is hoping a truce will permanently end killings and kidnappings, mainly by nomadic cattle herders. Government leaders say they want to tackle the injustices that fueled the crisis. Ahmed Idris reports from Zamfara.
For the past 2 months, not a single shot was fired in what was termed Nigeria's Wild West. No one was kidnapped for ransom, and no livestock was stolen. Village Chief Abdullahi Abubakar and his constituents are back from 18 months of self-imposed exile. Hunted down by bandits and vigilantes, he and people in this village are now enjoying what they say are the best moments of their lives in 2 years, a return to normalcy.
We were on the run from law enforcement, bandits and vigilantes for more than a year and a half. As small as this village is, it lost 10 people in the raids. Many have been kidnapped, including women and children. 1,000 cattle and sheep was stolen from us.
2 months ago, they returned home and are trying to rebuild their lives. For 8 years, bandits, mainly from nomadic herdsmen, terrorized and sacked entire villages in northwest Nigeria. Local vigilantes formed to protect communities became the law. The resulting violence killed more than 4,000 people and displaced tens of thousands. The state government says it's moving to address what the nomads call decades of exploitation and oppression by providing water, roads, and other services. It's also disbanding the militias that have been accused of killing Fulanis and denying them access to basic services.
The truce is holding for now. A few months ago, driving along this highway would have been extremely dangerous even for the security forces. But now a decent number of vehicles use the road. Killings and abductions used to happen here almost every day. So for most people, the relative peace they now enjoy seems and feels almost unreal.
And it's not only the displaced who are happy with the turn of events in Zamfara. The police who've been targeted in the mayhem say they realize that the force of arms cannot end the violence.
All along we have been having military or security actions in this state. But as far as I'm concerned, it has not worked, or it has not achieved appreciable progress in terms of decapitating the bandits. So I came with an idea of having a way of resolving this issue, that is using dialogue.
And that has started paying off. Several assault rifles and rocket launchers have been surrendered by the gunmen, and soon the police say hundreds more are expected. They say there never was a will to resolve the conflict in Zamfara state until recently.
I discovered that the political authority then were not serious on the matter. They have another idea, so I have to leave. But now the current administration, they felt they need somebody who would throw towards their line. Their line was to conflict resolution through dialogue.
But there are concerns that the truce won't hold for long, and whether an amnesty will not embolden other groups to take up arms against citizens and the state. For now, Abdullahi Abubakar and the people in this village are enjoying this newly found peace, and despite their losses, some of them can even afford to smile. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, Dogonwaya, northwest Nigeria.
Sunday worshippers in Zimbabwe have prayed for Robert Mugabe in the church he used to attend. The former president died in Singapore on Friday when he was receiving medical treatment. The 95-year-old is seen by many as a heroic freedom fighter who ended colonial rule. Critics regard him as a dictator who ordered death squads, rigged elections, and shattered the economy until his overthrow 2 years ago.
We are praying for our relatives who have died and our former president, Comrade Robert Mugabe. We bring him forward to God. We are asking God if there is anything he did wrong in his life, he be forgiven.
The U.S. agency which monitors elections has effectively shut down. The Federal Election Commission says it no longer has enough members to operate. That has potentially serious consequences for the 2020 presidential elections. Here's our White House correspondent, Kimberly Hawkett.
A political revolution.
It's more than a year away, but U.S. politicians are already campaigning to become America's next president. But there's fear foreign governments will interfere with the 2020 vote. Both Congress and U.S. intelligence agencies warn foreign meddling from not just Russia, but also China and Iran is now threatening the next U.S. election.
The Russians are absolutely intent on trying to interfere with our elections.
Making matters worse, the Federal Election Commission, or FEC, that preserves the integrity of U.S. voting, has stopped fully functioning. That's because last month the commission's vice chair resigned. The 6-member agency is now down to just 3 members. It needs 4 to operate. The FEC is considered one of the frontline agencies combating election interference. It was working to bolster transparency for online political ads, the same ads used by Russian operatives to manipulate voters on social media in 2016.
There was no collusion whatsoever.
A Justice Department investigation found Kremlin-linked associates contacted the campaign of Donald Trump in 2016, even though authorities determined none of it was illegal.
We know different state actors and non-state actors could be trying some of the same things that were tried in 2016 or expanding that playbook to more ways.
The FEC also investigates campaign finance violations and fines campaigns not following the law when it comes to so-called dark or secret money donations from potentially illegal sources. But without a quorum, the FEC can't do its job.
We're dealing with a situation where the money is pouring into the election. More money than ever is coming into the presidential election, the congressional elections. But right now, there's no one poring over that to make sure that the rules are being followed.
The influence of dark money on the 2020 U.S. presidential election is expected to exceed $1 billion. And it's not clear when the FEC will be fully staffed to investigate that spending. That means that money attacking political candidates will continue to flow from the shadows, denying U.S. voters election transparency. Kimberly Helkett, Al Jazeera, the White House.
Sudan's first cabinet since the ousting of former President Omar al-Bashir has just been sworn in. Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok announced his 20-member cabinet earlier this week. In it are 4 women, including Sudan's first female foreign minister. The centenary of an eye-catching architectural movement is being celebrated in Germany. Bauhaus inspired modern art, futuristic furniture and even glass palaces. And as Dominic Kane reports from Dessau, a new museum has opened in the city where it all began.
Mention Bauhaus here and immediately people think of places like this and the movement whose free-thinking revolutionized architecture. Certainly, that's true in Dessau, at the new museum housed within what's called the Black Box, which itself is enveloped by glass. Something people here hope will wow all who see it.
I wanted to be surprised after they cross this glass facade with the quality of this open space, and also to be contracted when they enter in the Black Box, and then they go to this intimate world of the Bauhaus of the last century.
One of the defining aspects of the Bauhaus is that for many people it has many different definitions, from its inception in the world of architecture through modern art to furniture design, and all of it encapsulating the freedom of expression. As this concept enters its second 100 years, here the first 100 exhibits that were shown in the first Bauhaus are preserved, offering us a window on an era when the founder of the school, Walter Gropius, encouraged his students to abandon old teaching styles and to embrace the new. Dorothea Brill is one of the curators here. She says part of the museum's task is to show Bauhaus was a living, breathing entity and not just something that can be treated as a piece of history.
There are the famous names and there are the famous iconic objects, but there are also
there's also very rich production of the students here who are maybe less known, but who were the center of the Bauhaus in Dessau.
When the movement began, Germany was emerging from the ruins of the First World War and beginning life as a democracy. Now its latest democratically elected leader has come to pay homage.
Even 100 years after its founding, we still feel today the fascination of the Bauhaus project. Bauhaus ideas, Bauhaus architecture, Bauhaus art and design influence us today in the way we build, in the way we live in and shape our world.
For generations of architects and artists, Bauhaus has been a watchword for cutting-edge design. Now, true to form, it's hoped this new museum will show that to its best effect. Dominic Kane, Al Jazeera, Dessau.
Still ahead in Al Jazeera, Serena Williams falls short yet again in her quest to equal the record for Grand Slam wins. Leah's going to have all the action.
I can unlock my phone with my face. You can access your bank account with your voice. Unique algorithmic measurements of us that are revolutionizing the process of identification. But biometrics are far from perfect. Their convenience and seeming infallibility comes at a price. Most crucially, our privacy.
In the fourth of a five-part series, Ali Ray addresses the appropriation of our most personal characteristics. All hail the algorithm on Al Jazeera.
Setting the discussions. For years, police in Cape Town have struggled to reduce deadly gang violence. Examining the headlines.
Now, under President Putin, Russia is making a push to engage.
Explore an abundance of world-class programming designed to inform, motivate, and inspire you.
It's almost second nature, and I also know what's at stake.
See the world from a different perspective on Al Jazeera.
It's time for the sports. Here's Leah.
Thank you, Rob. We start with Formula One, and Ferrari have claimed their first home victory in nearly a decade. Charles Leclerc won the Italian Grand Prix to claim his second straight victory after winning in Belgium last week. The last time Ferrari won at Monza, Leclerc was just 12 years old and was racing go-karts. Mercedes' Valtteri Bottas was second and championship leader Lewis Hamilton third. Leclerc overtakes his Ferrari teammate Sebastian Vettel in the overall standings after the German finished way down in 13th. Well, 19-year-old Bianca Andreescu is now Canada's first tennis Grand Slam champion. She stunned Serena Williams in straight sets to win the U.S. Open. David Stokes reports.
This was Serena Williams' fourth chance to equal the Grand Slam record. Standing in her way, a player half her age, Bianca Andreescu. Williams had royal support for this one. Meghan Markle sitting alongside her coach, mum, and sister Venus in the players' box. But it was the youngster who looked more comfortable in this battle of the generations. Playing in the main draw at Flushing Meadows for the first time, Andreescu showed great skill and power to leave Williams hopeless on the other side of the net. The 15th seed took the opening set 6-3, and she didn't relent, breaking two more times to lead 5-1 in the second set. And out of sorts Serena was on the verge of a heavy defeat. Andreescu tightened up though, failed to convert 2 championship points, and Serena fought back to 5 games all. The American crowd were back on their feet, but their excitement was short-lived. Andreescu broke once again and managed to wrap things up at the third time of asking. She's the first Canadian to win a tennis slam, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tweeted that she'd made the country proud. Andreescu is also the first teenager to win a major title since Maria Sharapova at Wimbledon in 2004. At the start of the year, she'd only played 6 tour-level matches, but she's won tournaments at Indian Wells, Toronto, and now the US Open. Her place in the history books is secured, but no doubt she'll play a big part in the sport's future too.
Your 2019 US Open Women's Champion, Bianca Andreescu.
This year has been a dream come true, and now being able to play on this stage against Serena, a true legend of this sport, is amazing.
As for Williams, she's now lost 4 straight major finals, and her disappointment was clear to see.
I believe that I could have just been more Serena today, and I honestly don't think Serena showed up, and I have to kind of figure out how to get her to show up in Grand Slam finals.
Andreescu's now up to 5 in the world rankings and pockets a winner's check of $3.85 million. Not bad for a 19-year-old. David Stokes, Al Jazeera.
Jamie Murray just won his 4th U.S. Open title in a row. He defended the mixed doubles trophy alongside American Bethany Maddox-Sands. They beat the top seed Chan Hao-Ching and Michael Venus in straight sets. England's cricketers are battling to save the Ashes on the final day of the 4th test against Australia. They face a mammoth task, having been set a target of 383 for victory. They're now 172 for 7 and now trying to hold on until the close of play. Australia need to take just 3 more wickets to win and ultimately retain the Ashes trophy. Well, another man who's had a good innings is Cecil Wright. The 85-year-old is retiring after a cricketing career that spans 6 decades. The former fast bowler played 1 first-class game for Jamaica against Barbados. That was back in 1958 and is said to have taken more than 7,000 wickets. Despite his love of the game, Wright says his body can't keep up.
When I started, I just want to keep going, and every time. And as I know, every time I get a wicket, I want 1 more. As I get 1, I want another one, you know. Sometimes when I'm walking back to where I feel a little bit, you know, and I think, oh, well, I think I've had enough now.
Khabib Nurmagomedov is now unbeaten for 28 career fights after unifying the UFC lightweight title. He stopped interim champion Dustin Poirier by submission in the 3rd round in Abu Dhabi and then jumped out of the octagon to celebrate with the UFC president Dana White. Much more welcome scenes than last time he jumped into the crowd when he started a brawl after his victory over Conor McGregor. All the talk is about who's next for Khabib, and he seems to have an idea.
My next opponent is very good steak with burger double cheese. Even if you're 28 and old, 12 and old in UFC, you're one of the biggest stars. You smash everybody. People gonna talk about you have to fight with him, you have to fight with him, you have to fight with him. Give me just respect.
In the NFL, it's been a busy few days for 7-time Pro Bowl receiver Antonio Brown. He's been with the Oakland Raiders since March, but after a string of off-field incidents which strained teammate relationships, he was released on Saturday. But just hours later, he announced he'd signed with the New England Patriots on a 1-year, $15 million deal. After more than 90 events, the Red Bull Air Race Series has come to an end with a new world champion. Australia's Matt Hall finally grabbed the title by a single point in Japan after competing for it for 10 years. Hall will be the last ever winner of the competition since sponsors decided to discontinue the race after this year. He got the news while he was still airborne.
And that puts you in 3rd place for the Chiba race. But congratulations, you have won the 2019 World Championship. Well done, Matt.
What a way to win. Well, I'll hand you back to Rob.
There is a happy man.
Yeah.
That's it from me, Rob Matheson, for this news hour. I'm going to be back in a moment with more of the day's news. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.
With the plummeting birth rate and families moving to the cities, South Korea's rural schools are shutting down. 101 East meets the grandmas who are saving these schools while finally getting an education. On Al Jazeera.
Al
Al Jazeera, wherever you are. 3 months of protests on an unprecedented scale that would virtually paralyze Hong Kong. What began as opposition to an extradition law escalated into a broader pro-democracy movement. So how and why did this crisis develop, and what would follow? In the second of 2 special reports, People and Power examines the causes and possible consequences of Hong Kong's Summer of Defiance on Al Jazeera.
President Trump made the right decision to say that's not going to work.
The U.S. Secretary of State says peace talks with the Taliban are dead for now after Donald Trump canceled a secret meeting in Camp David. Hello, I'm Rob Matheson. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up,
we haven't received anything, so it's still no. We're not going to start over every 3 months.
France threatens to veto any Brexit extension, even as a second cabinet minister lands another blow to Boris Johnson by resigning. The Syrian government says joint patrols by Turkish and US troops in the country's northwest is a blatant violation of its sovereignty. Fires at a train station and key roads blocked in central Hong Kong after a march on the US consulate gives way to chaos. US President Donald Trump says he's canceled a secret meeting with the Taliban in the United States. Leaders were supposed to fly to Camp David on Saturday night. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says talks with the Taliban are now dead for the time being, and the special envoy is being recalled. Meetings between him and the Taliban have been ongoing in Qatar for nearly a year.
And it was the case that when the Taliban tried to gain negotiating advantage by conducting terror attacks inside of the country, President Trump made the right decision to say that's not going to work. We're going to walk away from a deal if others try to use violence to achieve better ends in a negotiation. It's not right, it's not appropriate, it killed an American, and it made no sense for the Taliban to be rewarded for that kind of bad behavior.
Well, the Taliban released a statement in response saying Americans will suffer more than anyone else because of Trump's decision to cancel the talks. While the office of Afghan President Ashraf Ghani says peace will only be possible if the Taliban stop launching attacks and hold direct talks with the government.
We expected an outcome that could lead us to a ceasefire, that could lead us to a direct negotiation with the Afghan government and the Taliban. So unfortunately, that's we didn't see. On contrary, we saw and we observed that there could be risks to any process that the Afghan government is not the main stakeholder in that. And any process that cannot guarantee a ceasefire, a halt to the violence, could be harmful for all of the achievements that we've gained.
Well, Tony Bertley's standing by for us in Kabul. Let's first go to Rob Reynolds in Washington, D.C. Rob, what's been the reaction been in the U.S.?
Well, it's been mixed.